With a new Labour leader entering Downing Street shortly, all eyes are on what, if anything, Andy Burnham can do to strengthen the British economy. And one thing that keeps getting asked is whether he'll cut the welfare bill, which we're repeatedly told is exploding, it's out of control. But is it? Professor of Economics Jonathan Portes made this intervention on Sky News.
Let's do the economics of it first. Where does he have room to try and cut the welfare bill?
Well, I think that's in some ways not the right question. There's a lot of nonsense talked, including, unfortunately, on Sky about the spiraling welfare bill. If you look at the welfare bill as a proportion of national income, how much of the overall economy is devoted to the welfare bill, it's lower than it was 15 years ago, and it's pretty much back what it was under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. So this idea that it's out of control is just wrong.
So this is the first question that keeps getting put to every talking head, every economist, every sort of Andy Burnham outrider. Will Andy Burnham, he likes to be liked, so will he be brave enough to cut the spiraling welfare bill? If he's a serious sort of adult, not just someone with good eyelashes, surely he must be willing to punish disabled people, essentially, is what people seem to be arguing. As Jonathan Portes points out there, the welfare bill isn't actually spiraling. It's sort of the same level it's ever been. The Economist and Times columnist Simon French, by no means a lefty, shared this chart supporting Portes. So it shows the percentage of social security spending, excluding pensions, as a proportion of GDP over time. It's averaged 4.8% over the past 50 years, is currently 4.7%, so below that average. Difficult to see the fiscal emergency in that chart or anything running out of control. There has been a shift in the makeup of that spending, though. So sort of when people say there are a few things that do look worrying here, this is normally what they're talking about. So this chart shows the total welfare bill since 2007, including pensions. As you can see, under austerity, the total fell from 12 to 10%. The drop was for people of working age, and it caused a lot of harm. And as Portes says, the total bill is still way below what it was in 2010 when the Tories came to power. There are, though, two areas that have seen steady growth. So the state pension is one in dark blue, which is by far the largest expense and continues to grow as our population ages. And in red, non-pensioner payments for disability and incapacity have almost doubled in recent years, going from 1.2% of GDP to 2.1% between 2010 and 2025. So should that concern Andy Burnham? Well, the argument goes that if these keep growing, he'll have to raise taxes, which is politically difficult, or he'll have to borrow more. And if he borrows more for pensions and any kind of benefit, that will lead to higher interest rates, which will make it more difficult to borrow for the infrastructure upgrades that Britain desperately needs. And that's why one of his advisors, Andy Haldane, has suggested dropping the pensions triple lock. So the triple lock means pensions rise annually by either 2.5%, which is, or the average wage growth, or inflation. So it's one of those three, whichever is highest. This was Haldane's reasoning in the Financial Times for suggesting dropping that. So he said, the inability of the government to make meaningful cuts to public spending is its fiscal Achilles heel. This vulnerability can only be treated by taking politically costly action to curb public spending materially. Of the options, replacing the triple lock with a single lock to inflation index state pensions, as with all other benefits, is both fiscally prudent and socially equitable. It would yield a high and rising fiscal dividend of perhaps £5 billion. Recycling this into supporting youth employment would boost intergenerational equity. Now, I agree with Andy Haldane there. I think we should uprate pensions by the same we uprate all other benefits. I think the triple lock was originally introduced because pensioners disproportionately were in poverty in this country. That's no longer the case. Yes, pensioner poverty still exists, but we should be, because it's not disproportionately among pensioners, in fact, I think it's now lower among pensioners than many other groups, we should uprate them all by the same amount. The idea that pensions just go ever and ever higher, which would be if you always increase it by whichever is the highest of those three, doesn't seem particularly equitable to me. I'd say, yeah, do it by inflation. Or maybe average incomes, because if you do it by average incomes, then people of all ages have an interest in policies which will boost employment or boost wages, which I think would be good. At the moment, we increasingly have this divided electorate between people who have an interest in sort of economic growth more generally and are people who have an interest in asset prices going up. Again, this is not to moralize the argument. This is just to say, I think things work better if every age group has the same incentives, the same interests. Not just about age groups, by the way. It's also about who will inherit a house and who won't. But anyway, as I say, I think that probably makes economic sense. Pensioners, though, are a politically powerful group. Again, not moralizing. It just so happens that there are a lot of pensioners and they go out to vote. All power to them, which means it would be politically difficult to drop the triple lock. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it will be difficult. And that, I think, is why more attention falls on those on disability and sickness benefits. They're not as politically powerful. Disabled people, of course, already had an awful time under George Osborne. So the idea that they have it easy in Britain and should sacrifice again, that should be a political no-go area. Obviously, the reason we have a stagnant economy is not because of disabled people. However, there is an argument that there are some groups who the current status quo isn't working for, namely the increasing number of young people on PIP and incapacity benefits, especially for mental health. Alan Milburn is a former minister under Blair who's tipped to enter the Burnham government. He recently published an official review on young people out of work and came to this conclusion.
What is shameful, to use your word, is that, as we've uncovered in the course of this review, for every £25 that we spend keeping young people on benefits, we spend only £1 helping them get into work through employment support.
So the taxpayer is spending 25 times as much money.
25 quid, 25 times as much, exactly right.
On benefits for young people.
Correct.
Than helping them get the skills they need to get into work.
Correct. So this is a failure. This is a failure of the welfare system, but it's a failure, I'm sorry, of the school system, the skills system, the health system. What we're doing is we're not prioritising getting young people into a situation where they can be learning or earning, and instead we're transporting them into the world of benefits with incalculable costs for their life chances.
So in that report, he found this. Shockingly, 6 in 10 young people who are NEET, that's not in education, employment or training, today have never had a job, up from 4 in 10 in 2005, at the very point when they should be starting adult life, gaining confidence, building skills, learning the habits of work and taking their first steps towards independence. Too many are becoming detached from education and employment altogether. We are at risk of a lost generation. Administrative data shows that PIP claims are getting longer in duration, with 87% of 16 to 24-year-olds in the 2019 cohort still on the benefit 5 years later, compared to 74% of the 2013 cohort. Only 25% of young people in receipt of PIP at age 24 are in work. The employment prospects of a young person claiming PIP get 21% worse over 6 years, whereas for everyone else, they get 31% better. Banseka, this is going to keep coming up. What is your position on all of this? When Andy Burnham's asked about sort of will he cut benefits, should he just say, no, there's no problem here, you're just giving me Tory talking points? Or should he say, we will make some changes?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm totally against making some changes around pensions. What I want to avoid, partly for kind of societal reasons, I think, is that I don't wish for us to do too much of a kind of young people versus old people sort of situation where, you know, the interests of pensioners are diametrically opposed to the interests of younger people, because I think it's more complex than that. So I hope that the debate doesn't get kind of squeezed into something overly simplistic, like, well, we just reverse the triple lock, single lock, and then it'll all be great and we'll have plenty of money to fund young people. I was interested in some of the stuff Andy Burnham said earlier this week about young people. It got kind of hidden in amongst the number 10 presence in Manchester and stuff like that. The media didn't report on it much, but he seems to be positioning himself as someone who wants to offer some kind of a New Deal almost to younger people, right? And more of an active industrial state that can create more jobs, for people. He talked about vocational education, all of that stuff. He talked about welfare reform. He talked about it potentially maybe doing it through investment, you know, investing in services rather than just saying we're going to scrap, you know, welfare and good luck to you, like Kemi Badnocher maybe seems to be suggesting. If I'm honest, I think there are actually other parts of the state where we could make more savings. I think there's lots of waste in defence, actually. There's been actually a number of scandals. Declassified have done a lot of reporting on this. There's been a number of kind of overspending scandals of, you know, defence contracts being sent out to companies, for example, like Ajax, to build things like armoured vehicles, and they've spent, you know, 5.5 billion, and they are already something like 5-6 years late on delivering that product, and the state has spent a lot of money on that, for example. So I'm not against cuts. I'm not against slimming down the state in some areas. I actually think there are huge, vast areas where we do waste a lot of money procuring, big business to do a shoddy job sometimes. But I do think that we have slashed at the welfare more than enough now.
Yeah, I mean, austerity was awful, and especially for disabled people. I mean, I don't think the argument is crazy to say that if you've got lots of young people with mental health problems who are on PIP, it might not actually be that's not necessarily the best way to deal with this problem. And sort of like, if you focus the state, because Alan Milman was basically saying we spend a lot more money on benefits than we do on getting people into work. And I can see the argument for sort of like changing that. It's a bit like the argument about housing benefit and building council homes.
Yeah.
I'm very much into sort of how the state should focus on being productive and sort of like building stuff and training people and not just do cash transfers. Yeah. And I do think that sort of maybe the focus of the left has for a very long time been on sort of cash transfers and actually an argument about how do we build a productive state, which is very much present now. I'm not making an original point here. There's literally like a bunch of reports at the moment called the productive state. But I think that is the right focus for me. Should we move on to devolution? Because Burnham's positive focus so far has been on devolution, both of power and investment out of the southeast and into England's regions. The argument here is that growth has been too focused on the south. It's pretty much undeniable. So this graph from the Times shows which regions collect more in tax than they spend. As you can see, with the exception of London and the southeast, every region is in deficit, spending more than it delivers in tax to the Treasury. Now that looks like a situation that doesn't really benefit anyone. So London and the southeast attracts all the investment, so they're sort of the winners in that respect. But then, they can say they bail out the rest of the country with transfers, right? So it's not really good for London. It's not good for the rest of the country because, it'd be better for London if they could keep more of that money. I mean, obviously, it'd be better for the rest of the country if some of the investment would go there, right? So not a good situation. If devolution could solve that, that would be good. Obviously, there are big open questions about whether it will. What is undeniable is this is not normal. So this chart shows the GDP per worker in various European cities in different countries. So the size of the circle represents its population. If you look at the UK at the bottom, London, which is the large yellow circle there, much more economically productive than the next biggest cities, which all lag far behind. Now that's unusual. So in France or Germany, the gaps between the most productive cities are much smaller. And also you can see that, Britain just has way more unproductive cities than France, which is a shame. Obviously the people that say what we need to do so that we can be productive like France is just cut taxes and have lower regulations. Well, guess what? Taxes in France are 53% of GDP. And I don't think many people argue it's a low regulation economy. So be more like France, Fonseca, is my position.
Is that because you got France in the sweepstakes?
Because I got France. Well, so we're gonna move on from. We'll come back to the serious topic in a moment, but just to fill you in on the conversation we were having before we went live. So in the sweepstakes, I've got France. In the internal Novara media sweepstakes, I've got France and Paraguay actually, but no one's put money in yet. And I always think that in a sweepstake, the money should be collected at the beginning. Because am I now supposed to go on our Slack channel and say, by the way, no, should we all put our money in now? Because everyone knows I've got France going to be really transparent. Or am I supposed to just send a Monzo request to everyone if France win, like requesting £5? Like, I feel like both of those things would make me look like a scumbag. So ultimately, if France win, I'm going to lose £100. Just like, I'm in a really, really tough situation here.
Could have invested that in Bitcoin and all sorts.
Could have invested that in Trump coin or anything.
Damn.
Anyway, we should go back to this thing. What are we talking about? Mid-sized cities. Do you back the devolution agenda?
Yeah, I think it's a necessary agenda, isn't it? And I think that is something which I think is an interesting proposition about a potential Burnham government. I think it's something that a lot of people want to hear. Of course, London and the southeast do get massively advantaged. There's lots of poverty, of course, in those areas as well. But we know that's a big issue in this country. I suppose my question really, and again, he's not put himself forward to give more detail about this because he's not really taking many questions from journalists, I think, at the moment, Andy Burnham. The question I suppose I have about devolution is it's all very well and good devolving more power to those places to be able to make more decisions about how money is spent and making sure money gets to the right places. But within those enclaves, within Manchester or Birmingham or Leeds or these other places outside of the sort of London and Southeast bubble, there's still inequality within those places as well, right? Like Manchester is not there's a variety of different class experiences happening within Manchester. What happens when you give those places power and you give those power holders who are already there more power to make those decisions? Are they just going to replicate a lot of the same disparities that already exist within those cities and within those places? Unfortunately, we've not been able, well, Andy Burnham has not been grilled or questioned on that yet. Maybe he doesn't have the detail. In principle, of course, I'm very in favour of devolution. I think it's actually something politically quite necessary. And it's something I think is playing well against a kind of highly centralised Labour government under Keir Starmer, where I think a lot of people felt very unlistened to. But there's lots of questions about what does it actually mean to do devolution well, where we don't just end up replicating the same disparities that already exist in a lot of these places that have been historically underinvested.
So I suppose the argument against that, I mean, obviously, there's obviously a value there, but the argument as to why regional inequality matters, even if you keep sort of the same inequality within cities, is that, I mean, it seems better to be a person on low income in London than in sort of than in Hull, for example, right? Like that's shown in the educational outcomes. It's shown in like the aspiration and the social mobility. Because if you are in a booming city, especially if you're a private renter and you're not getting housing benefits, it's difficult. But if you're in social housing in a sort of booming city, the growth, the sort of like cultural dynamism you get to experience and benefit from. Schools perform much better in those locations because they can attract teachers. Like the NHS performs better in those places because they can attract doctors. So there is, obviously, ideally, you would have a devolution agenda whereby all of these different cities grow and they also tackle inequality within those cities. But I think there's also an argument that says, regardless of that, it's better to live in a richer city than live in a poorer city, whatever class you are, which I suppose is why people generally move to bigger cities if they can.
Right. So there's an element of that incrementalism there, I suppose. Will that be enough for Burnham?
I mean, it depends. I suppose the other way of looking at it is that in Manchester, they made the decision to say, we want Manchester to boom. And they actually did it in a way which wasn't particularly egalitarian. Yep. They were like, we're going to invite private capital to build loads of big ass buildings. Then Burnham comes in afterwards and says, okay, let's now spread some of this wealth. But there's an argument, did they need to get the private investors in first for it to work? Yeah. Same as with China, right? I said this on Wednesday in a brilliant interview with Jayati Ghosh, very interesting person, where he said, Deng said, we have to let some people get rich first.
Let some get rich, yeah.
Now, obviously, they were very poor developing countries, so that doesn't necessarily apply here, but there's sort of, just saying there's sometimes tensions.